thank you for joining us once again for our daily 4 o'clock update on COVID-19 here at the COVID-19 Communication Center, which is an initiative of the Government of the Republic of Namibia through the Ministry of Information, Communication and Technology, as well as the Ministry of Health and Social Services. We would also like to thank our media partners who have since day one been very committed and dedicated to broadcasting our timely and authenticated information around COVID-19 updates in Namibia. As we continue now this afternoon to further delve into the issues of higher education, we are joined by panelists from our different institutions working in the higher education sector. Firstly, we are joined by Mr. Chandra Finis, who is the chairperson on the Committee of COVID-19 in NANSO. Thank you very much and welcome. We are also joined by Mr. Jerry Biekus, who is the Namibia Training Authority CEO. Welcome. We are also joined by Mr. Hipa Murangi, who is the chairperson of the Association of Private Institutions in Namibia. Thank you very much for joining us. Also in the audience, we have the acting CEO of the Namibian Students Financial Assistance Fund, Mr. Kennedy Kadume, who is ready to answer any questions or queries that might be available to him. However, as usual, before we dive into the questions and queries and sectoral discussion on higher education, we will have a health update by our Deputy Minister of Ministry of Health and Social Services, Honorable Dr. Esther Mwinyangwe, to give us an update. Doctor.
Thank you, Honorable DM. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm coming from the Ministry of Health and Social Services. We are expected to update the nation on a daily basis or on a regular basis. I have to mention that if I have to say something today, I will just repeat what I said yesterday. Because for now, we also don't have new cases that have been reported. So we still stand at the number 16. But I want to, because there are questions that people are asking with regard to what is the difference between a suspect case, probable case, and I want to just clarify on those. A suspect case is a patient with acute respiratory illness, that is fever, and at least one sign or symptom of respiratory disease, for example, cough, shortness of breath, and a history of travel to or residence in a location reporting community transmission of COVID-19 disease during the 14 days prior to symptom onset. But I want to emphasize that so far, we also don't have any reports of community transmission, because our cases are people who have been in contact with others who have been traveling or who themselves have been traveling to other countries. Or a suspect case could also be a patient with any acute respiratory illness and having been in contact with a confirmed or probable COVID-19 case in the last 14 days prior to symptom onset. Or a suspect case could also be a patient with severe acute respiratory illness, fever, and at least one sign or symptom of respiratory disease. For example, cough, shortness of breath, and requiring hospitalization. And in the absence of any alternative diagnosis, that fully explains the clinical presentation. Now, what is a probable case? Because this is also one of the questions that people are asking frequently. A probable case is a suspect case for whom testing for COVID-19 is inconclusive. Inconclusive meaning that is indeterminate. So, which means that another test needs to be done to make sure. Then confirmed case is a person with laboratory confirmation of COVID-19 infection, irrespective of clinical signs and symptoms. Those are the three questions that are frequently asked. And since we don't have enough time and the focus now is on education, everyone out there is concerned about what is happening to our learners. We don't have the necessary equipment at home. Some kids are living far in remote areas where they don't even have the devices or electricity. So let us also now give time to the experts in the field and listen to them. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Dr. Esther Mwinyangwe, for that update. I hope that is clear and that you continue to join us here this afternoon to respond to any further queries or questions around health amid COVID-19. I now move over to our panelists. We're now discussing higher education, and I'm very happy that we're joined by the NTA because even earlier we had some questions around vocational education. We got some queries via our email address, ladies and gentlemen, which is covid.nam@mict.gov.na around vocational training. Mr. Beekers, we understand that vocational training is a very practical exercise for many of the trainees, whether it's a contact with the trainers. So we'd like to know really what is NTA doing to ensure that training continues for trainees, whether it's maybe perhaps materials that they can access or places that they can continue practicing the trade they would like to be masters in, and what interventions is NTA taking in that regard?
Thank you, Honourable Deputy Minister, for the opportunity. If you would allow just for me to create a bit of a context for technical vocational education and training in the country. At the time of independence in 1990, we essentially had just an apprenticeship system. And the last statistic I saw was about 150 apprentices in the system back then, with essentially no training institutions as we know today in the form of public vocational training centers and private training providers. So that's where we're coming from as a country, and we may recall subsequent to that, we've even done away with the apprenticeship system until about 2 years ago. Also, at that time, the focus was primarily on some construction-related trades, what we would term technically oriented or traditional trades. So fast forward to 2015-16, when the Ministry of Higher Education, Technology and Innovation was then created or recreated, we started with the crafting of a comprehensive transformation and expansion plan for the TVET sector. And we've done that work, and we've aligned that plan fully to NDP 5, the Harambee Prosperity Plan, and other national agendas and programs such as the Growth at Home strategy. But that plan has two key pillars. It speaks firstly to increased intake in the TVET system. Now you can understand we're coming from 150 at the time of independence as apprentices. So increased intake, and that will be done through the establishment of a footprint of public vocational training centers in all 14 political regions of the country. And that's work in progress that started already a year and a half, 2 years ago. But also expansion of existing public vocational training centers to ensure they can increase their intake, they can diversify the programs they offer, they begin to shift focus away from just the traditional trades and occupations and respond more meaningfully to the needs of industry, even where they are located, looking at the natural resources in those regions and constituencies and areas, and move into leather crafting, basket weaving, wood carving as potentially new trades and occupations to respond to the needs of those communities. But we now in 2020, and here's the context in 2020, we now have, as the Namibia Training Authority, about 96 training providers in the TVET space registered with us. 86 of those are actively in training, and at the end of last year, the total intake in the system was just under 35,000. So here's the scope of what we're dealing with. As the training authority responsible for regulation or regulating the system, funding trainees at registered and accredited training providers, but also supervising training at public vocational training centers. We started with our contingency and scenario planning as early as the first week in March. So we've now reached a point where we have developed 3 scenarios as our mitigating strategies. Scenario 1 speaks to the current scenario where the regulations dictate that the lockdown period will last until 17th of April. So scenario 1 basically indicates that should all things be equal and we can go back to training by Monday the 20th of April, we basically then need to make up for 3 weeks of lost time. During this period, there was to be a 1-week break, in any case in March, so we're losing 3 weeks up to the 20th of April. If we can go back into training, we have measures in place, and we are discussing these proposals with private providers also in the background to say through the additional measures, whether it's afternoon, evening classes, Saturdays, can we make up for lost time? We have shifted our calendar slightly also in terms of timelines for national assessment. So under this first scenario, the timeline for the May-June assessment will move slightly towards the end of June, snaking over into July. And then the second assessment round, national assessment, towards the end of the year, whereas level 1 assessment would have started in September and level 2 and 3 in November up to early December, we will have one big assessment round starting essentially on the 9th of November and ending around 14 December. We know that will be a massive undertaking, but we can plan for it and we can execute that successfully. That is scenario 1. Scenario 2 that we are now discussing with our private training providers also speaks to the eventuality where we need, and government may, extend the lockdown period with an additional 30 days beyond 17th of April. That essentially takes us to the 11th of May. If we can then resume training, it means we'll start with training, the mid-year recess will be reduced to 1 week, and we'll have one assessment round only at the end of this year, from early November to mid-December. But some trainees may not be ready for training, so we'll have a special assessment round also then in in March next year, snaking over to the beginning of April. So that's how we're going to mitigate. The third scenario, and the one that we really do not want to go into for now, is where the lockdown period, and perhaps countrywide for that matter, is extended for a longer period, and we therefore then need to recalibrate altogether. But these are conversations we have. Coming back to your question specifically, Honorable Deputy Minister, we understand the nature of vocational training. If you look at particularly your technical trades, 70 to 80% of the curriculum content is practical in nature. That is what we do in our workshops, training workshops. And so it becomes challenging to maneuver around that. Unless we understand beyond 17 April what the restrictions would be countrywide in terms of lockdown, movement of our citizens, and whether we can begin then to bring trainees back to the centers in small groups. The good thing about the workshops is that the workstations are spaced out. So social distancing and so on would not be a challenge. It would be more in terms of national measures pertaining to movement of people. What we've also done, and as part of the transformation and expansion strategy about a year and a half ago, with support from the European Union and GIZ, we've started with a pilot on e-learning in Tibet, focusing more so on the theoretical components of, or component of the curriculum, which is that 25 to 30% on average, particularly in the technical trades. So we have that experience now that we can build on as well. But like I said, to a large extent, it will be confined to the theoretical component. Lastly, I would want to say the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and UNESCO have started a survey a couple of days ago, and we are participating in this, looking at TVET institutions globally to understand what they are doing and what they can potentially do to bridge this gap, particularly in terms of practical training. So there could be some pockets of excellence across the globe that we can capitalize on as we move ahead in terms of planning from a scenario and contingency perspective.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Piekas. Mr. Morangi, earlier when we were discussing around higher education with the University of Namibia, NUST, as well as the ED of the Ministry of Higher Education, Technology and Innovation, there was a question around private institutions and the interventions to ensure that students continue learning if they're prepared for that. But also secondly, the issues around tuition fees, that some institutions are requiring students to now settle or pay for this year's tuition fees. However, there's obviously this COVID-19 situation going on. So what are the responses regarding that?
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. As we all know, or now that we should know, that private higher education institutions rely heavily on tuition fees. And without funding, it's impossible to operate. So what has happened now is that the global epidemic has hit everyone so hard that you will have to evolve and to start meeting the targets that are set for you to reach. So what many of us have done, we have converted many of these content into e-learning as a platform that will allow learning to continue. Based on that, it takes quite a lot of things. It takes system development. You still need to pay for tutors that need to create the content. You still need to convert this content into interactive, whether it's video, text, or simply just PowerPoint presentation that you can publish. So for as long as learning will continue, there will be payments required from all of us because we need to pay for the services that we are going to render, and we need to engage in this whole fight together. What I need to mention is that the Ministry of Higher Education, Training and Innovation really was forthcoming. They engaged us from the word go. What we have done as private higher education institutions, we are fighting this battle as a unit. We want to speak the same language. Eventually, we'll be at the level where we're going to exchange content to see how we can enhance all our platforms that we are going to use to offer to our students. So unfortunately, learning will continue, and we have already started. We are working from home. We have already started migrating to e-learning. So most of our content are now on the platforms that students can still access and interact. I was talking to a few head of centers and rectors of the institutions yesterday, and they have some figures of students already accessing and engaging their tutors as well as the lecturers. So there is already a process happening in the background. Now, let alone that of only distance learning. These include the face-to-face students that had to adapt to the new mode of learning, which is now online through e-learning or blended learning, whatever you're going to call it in the future. But unfortunately, the epidemic will teach us quite a lot of things. We should now start thinking that our mode of learning moving forward will have to adapt to what the world is moving towards. So e-learning will be a new thing. I think most of us will take a hit in terms of converting the content into those platforms, developing the required system to be able to offer these. And the challenge will remain, which we're obviously going to discuss later, on how to access the content.
Of course.
And so on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morangi. Mr. Finis, as an organization that is there to, of course, represent students around issues, especially now in trying and difficult times, what would the organization do to assist, of course, the different stakeholders, but especially students, in accessing some of those things being discussed here, like e-learning, and perhaps bringing less students to training centers to be able to do their practicals and so on?
Well, firstly, I think we must commend the NTA for taking student welfare into their approaches. I think Mr. Jerry mentioned something very important where he said that they're making a second provision in their second scenario for those trainees that are not aware. And NANSO has been clear from the beginning. This is all we are asking. We are not against online learning. We want to support online learning, but we want to support an online learning that is just and equitable, so that access is there for everyone. So what we are saying as an organization, and we've made this position clear even to the Ministry of Higher Education, is that let us come together as stakeholders and let us have a coordinated response towards the continuation of education. But the problem right now is you find that institutions are left to make decisions for themselves. And that includes institutions of the private sector. And we fundamentally believe that the private sector institutions must have access to the stimulus package that was released by government so that we can relieve students of tuition fees. The entire economy has stopped in two of the biggest regions. People are not going to work. There's a lot of uncertainties. We cannot put that burden, that stress on students while studying, not knowing at what point they'll be cut off because the private institution needs its tuition fees. So we believe that government has already made provisions for the private institutions through this package because we have a government that thinks ahead and that takes society and the context of the situation into consideration. And NANSO is ready at all points in material times to take any partner by the hand. If they want us to give volunteers, we have healthy volunteers that we can work with them and we can send volunteers out. But we are asking to be put at the table with the stakeholders so that we engage. In the interim, after yesterday, we are glad to announce that a number of private entities have approached us on the issue of accessibility, especially of internet services to students. We're in talks with them. I don't want to reveal anything too early, but we want these talks not to take place between NANSO and the private sector. We need government on board. We need our institutions on board, not only our universities. We must take into consideration the NTA and the trainees. In fact, the trainees are some of the most important student base right now, because we believe this is the time the trainees should be producing hand sanitizers in their workshops. They should be producing masks. They should be producing mechanisms to help our people wash their hands, especially in the informal settlements. And we look forward as an organization to engage the NTA and those institutions to see how we can work together as stakeholders to make that happen as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. I think all of yours positions are very clear. I now give it over to the media practitioners in the room to post any questions to the three panelists as well as to the NASFAF CEO who is in the building. We have one. Can I get a second? Two and a third one.
My first question goes to Mr. Murangi, and I've asked this question before. I don't know if I'm not maybe clear enough, so I'm not getting an answer. There are private institutions, number one, that are basically threatening students that if they do not pay or come in good standing with the institutions, then they won't be considered when all of this is all over, although alternative learning has not been introduced. That's number one. Number two, what is your institution, together with the Executive Director of Higher Education, doing to make sure that there is quality control in the move to this alternative learning? And then number three, also, we do know that the Executive Director of the Higher Education this morning said that the private institutions, and maybe this is also for NANSO to take note, the private institutions do have access to the relief. Are you already engaging with the private institutions to maybe collectively? Because at the end of the day, these days are going by, and it seems that a number of the private institutions, especially the smaller ones, are in limbo of what is going on. And then my other questions are to NANSO. Your position, I think a few days ago, you have written a letter to say that if even the one student does not have access to these alternative means of learning, even if one, you say that they shouldn't go forward with that. Does this mean that your position changes when it comes to basic education? Because you haven't made yourself clear on that. That's number one. And then also again for NANSO, what are you doing to protect your students to make sure that they don't fall victim to institutions that are not making sure that there's quality control and are also not being bullied into paying fees, especially when their parents are not in positions to pay, number one, and also there is no indication as to how exactly teaching and learning is going to continue.
Then we can get into responses.
We are here as private institutions to complement what the government is doing and to also try to help them reach the set goals. So we're also here to offer alternative learning. And most importantly, as institution of private higher institutions, we do not rely on government funds at this time point. I need to mention that we have had quite a few engagements with the ministry of late. And we have been discussing means as to how we can go about to try and also assist and fund private institutions. Now, in terms of access of students to the platforms, you need to bear in mind that most institutions had dual modes of offering these courses. Most of them were face-to-face, with a provision of having online conduct classes. So for those that went ahead and produced this material, they were in a much fortunate step. We have those that started of late to try and put this content in an e-learning format. You must bear in mind, it comes at cost. And when I spoke to most of them, they are halfway there. So most of the content will be available for the students to access. So I am really not sure of any institution under the affiliation that has sent students away. So for that reason, we will be required to still pay the tuition fees because we still need to create the content. We still need to have this content available for the students. We still need to pay for the premises. We still need to pay for all the resources that are required for us to have this moving. So for that reason, it is only fair that we fight this thing together. I mean, I will not be able to be in a position to provide you with the content if I do not have the capacity to produce this content. So as of to the access of the funds, I have mentioned that before, that we are in negotiations with, or we are talking to the ministry. We had a meeting with the ED earlier also, so we are in discussion with them. I think what we are not facing right now, maybe I can just discuss this in advance. Thank you also for your input, Mr. Finis. We are not here to sell you dreams. We are here to make sure that learning continues. For that reason, the most important stakeholder will be the student out there. How do you get access to online content if you do not have, say, a tablet, you don't have a smartphone or laptop, or you don't have Wi-Fi at home, which is a situation with many of us in Namibia for that matter. So we did not go to sleep. We rather engaged in all stakeholders. The ministry, for instance, is busy talking to the biggest internet service providers to try and find solution as to how we can lock bandwidth onto student portals where they can access video and content to make sure that it is there, it is affordable, and it is accessible. It is not a fight that private institutions can fight on their own without funding. I am sorry to mention that, but it is the case right now. It is a reality. So we are continuing to engage, and we are continuing to find solution. But at this time in point, there is no better solution than online, because it is not easy to get students in one room because we have to practice social distancing. So continuous assessment will continue, whereby students can submit assignments online. They need to be marked, mind you. So you need to have tutors, you need to have back office staff processing these things to get them done so that we can release assignments and assignment results. So this is an ongoing process. It is a fight. Bear in mind that we have only been this maybe for the past 2 weeks and so on, but it is fortunate that many private institutions anticipated the way forward in learning, that e-learning is the way forward, and that is what we need to adapt to. So the migration is taking place. We are not completely migrated onto e-learning, but we are a step into the right direction.
Thank you. Mr. Finis.
I think it's important to understand that our state functions, and part of quality assurance has already been thought out by the state. That's why we have the Namibian Qualifications Authority. And we as NANSU truly hope, and we call on them to be very proactive during this time, to ensure that whatever programs move online, even though against our wishes currently, that there's quality assured in those programs. So we believe in state capacity, and we believe in state institutions that can take that capacity forward. I want to do a call on Mr. Murangi and his organization and the private sector in general. This is not a time for the private sector to think about profits. And I can see in his rhetoric that he's not referring to profits. He's referring towards money to operate and to be able to continue operating. So even understanding that normal tuition fees would function in a normal economy and they can make profits. We as NANSO are calling to private institutions to say that government, we are asking government to assist you. And we are asking government to make sure you can continue to operate within a space where you can continue offering education. Students need education. We're getting to access in a while. But what we're saying is that government might not be able to provide as much as that private tuition would have been able to provide for you to continue. So we plead to the humanity of your capitalism to, through this crisis, let's ride it out together. We don't want any businesses to close, especially education businesses, because we already have a problem with access in general. And we are just asking you that students should not be forced to pay any tuition fees if they can't. If they can, if they are privileged enough, they should. But when you find some of your members have a large amount of students that cannot afford, don't turn them away. Come to us as NANSO. We will take your cause to government. We will work with you to ensure that those students aren't turned away. Because at this point in time, we need to think about our own sustainability as individuals, but also our sustainability as a nation. And the education sector will be the backbone that will take us out of this crisis as soon as we defeat Corona.
Thank you.
My first question, I'm hoping that someone from the Ministry of Education is here to, Higher Education is here to answer it, but NANSO perhaps can also answer the question. I wanted to find out about the students that are in foreign countries. I know that at the beginning of the outbreak, there was a lot of discussions about students that were in China, and it's my understanding that there were funds allocated to them in terms of the cost of living that is now currently high. So I just wanted to find out, because some students were complaining that they received letters that they cannot, they will not be able to receive that money anymore. So they just wanted to find out what is the follow-up of the students that are in the most affected areas like China and also the USA. What is NANSO doing, or what is the Ministry of Education doing to follow up with these students? And also my other question is on data. I know NANSO, you mentioned that you are in communication with data service providers. I just wanted to find out, because some students are asking that data should be made affordable since we are looking at e-learning. Does your discussions also include making data affordable for the students? And my last question is to Mr. Kennedy, Acting CEO of NASFAF. I just wanted to find out, students are asking that, are they able to get their refunds so that they will be able to buy laptops for them to have access to e-learning? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we can start with Mr. Kennedy, then we get over to the panel. Mr. Kennedy, the floor is yours to respond to that question.
Thank you, Honorable. Before I respond to the question, I just want to make an observation. One is that as in higher education sector, we prepared two documents. One is talking to the need of both private and public institutions. What is that is needed in terms of connectivities, bandwidth and internet connectivities. And the other one is relating to what is needed by NASFAF to enable to address issues pertaining to students. In that regard, we have requested Treasury to avail 282 million for us to enable to do an early dispensement, both to public and private institutions, as well as to make disbursement to students for non-tuition fee, for them to able to acquire tools that are needed for online and virtual learning. And I think that will address the last question. We don't really talk about refund anymore. We are talking about non-tuition fee. We are preparing to pay 10,000 per student as non-tuition fee to assist students for them to acquire again necessary tools and for them to have connectivity. If everything goes according to plans, by next week we should be able to start with that process. Treasury has assured us, as well as the Line Ministry, that that request is being entertained and the money will be released soon. Regarding the foreign student, As far as students in China are concerned, you might recall that China is one of the countries that was affected by this disease in December and as early as December or November. We have processed payment to our students in China. That's now quarterly payment that I'm talking about, for them really to mitigate whatever circumstances they might find themselves in. We have paid $1,300 per student at the beginning of March. We hope that really has helped students in mitigating whatever need they might face. Any other student with due payment, we have also processed. We have processed payment to students in Africa whose payments are due. Again, taking into consideration that they might find themselves in an extraordinary situation given the outbreak of this disease. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Finis?
I think just briefly on the first question about international students, NANSO does have a network of international representatives in countries where we have large amounts of students. We are in contact with students in China. In fact, just before I got here, we were speaking to the representative in China. We are aware also that specifically with China, that the Ministry of International Relations, because that's where the breakout happened, and the Ministry of Higher Education has been working with the embassy there and the various scholarship authorities, because not all our students in China are on NASFAF and benefit from this refund, and there have been provisions made for them. I think we'll remember in the beginning of the crisis, we had a lot of uproar, especially in the media, about students requesting to be repatriated, but some of our students have even communicated that they feel safer now there because China has been able to deal with this virus. So what we are also calling for is for our members across the world for right now to keep it calm and contact us if they have any material difficulties where they are under quarantine or under lockdown, and we will see how we can assist them. We know that the government has always been responsive and helpful within this regard, and we'll be able to take care of their issues prudently in that regard. I think there was a second question. If you could just repeat.
Data.
The data, yes. So we are engaging, like I said, with a very early stage. Part of the engagement is to give an initial set of data towards students, where they will only be able to access certain websites that's relevant towards their studying experience. So we're working out those technicalities, which websites and so on and so forth. And then post that, we are looking at student data packages, where your number is registered through your university that you are a student, so only students will be able to benefit from these data packages. Honorable Deputy Minister, forgive me also, earlier there was a journalist that asked about our position on basic education in terms of online learning, if I can just for 30 seconds clarify that. So what we as NANSO is saying that we don't have a problem with online learning. In fact, for basic education, we are coming up with a plan for the national broadcaster to look at how we can mobilize the national broadcaster and other partners so that we provide video lessons. If we can open up 3 channels, and we can look at radio as well for more remote places. It is within every stakeholder's best interest that education continues. All that NANSO is saying, that should we continue, every single student that falls under the flag and constitution of the Republic of Namibia and that is registered should have equal access towards that platform, so that we make sure everyone passes, because we don't want even 200 to 500 students to come to us at the end of the year and say everyone in our classes have passed and in our institutions have worked their way, they've worked and they've moved on. And we couldn't, simply because we weren't able to afford data and we weren't able to access electricity and other means to be able to log on. So that's all we're saying. We welcome all partners. We think the ministry must take charge of this, and let's get everyone access, and then we continue online.
Thank you very much. Therefore, I'd like to give you an opportunity to basically just tell us really from what is the way forward from here. with regards to, of course, the different positions that all of you have come up as possible action plans, but really what from here? What can the students expect? Is it better communication as to what plans each institution or group of institutions have for their educational future, and how best we can meet each other halfway to ensure that all of us pull our weight during this very difficult times? Perhaps we can start with you, Mr. Morangi.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. One of the challenges that we have, obviously, when we talk about e-learning, there is an end user who is the student who needs to have access to the technology, being it the hardware, being the platform. And since we know it's online, you need to have data packages. It's fascinating to know what NANSO has been up against. And I must just reiterate that as stakeholders, we need to engage more so that we can share the same ideas on platforms as such, so we can establish one goal for all of us, being it from the institutions, also the students from the other end. I need to reiterate that everything that we do has a cost behind. And with little funding, there is nothing you can do to develop the solution for the students. So the outcry of private institutions for funding, it's not a blurry thing that we're just putting out there. We really in need of funding to be able to make sure that we commit to the objectives that we have set for ourselves. So we have now migrated to e-learning, which we have to because we need to have learning continuing. So one of the things that we might need to acquire will be laptops or tablets for the students that will come at cost. Can we imagine what the US dollar is against our dollar right now at the moment? For us to procure that, we need resources for that. Even though it might come partly from the student, partly from the institution, partly from the government, we need to get there and to discuss these matters. We need to have improved networks, our network coverage. I'm sure from what I've seen, the service providers have quite a big coverage around the country, but not necessarily as sufficient as you might need for broadcasting video, for instance, which is also one of the things that is required because the tutors at the private institutions and the lecturers are now producing content. And those are ours because I don't want to refer to it as a backlog at this timing point, but we need to get these hours to get this content out to the students. So it takes a lot of overtime for these people, and you need to be remunerated for that matter. We might need to acquire dongles for internet access for those that have laptops that don't have necessarily smartphone that they can share and so on, but we'll be engaging with all stakeholders. And what we have successfully done, thank you from NASFAF, that we have tried to fast track the little funding that is there, the part that comes from the students who come to the institution, also to fast track, so that we be able to sustain what we are doing within our processes as well. It has not been easy. What we want to do today is to put all our students at ease, to ensure that they have access to the learning platforms that we have created for them. It is taking us a lot of time. It is taking us a lot of resources, but also it is very difficult for us to try and source skills elsewhere because we even though we don't live in isolation, that's the complexity of the situation that we happen to find ourselves into. So we urge patience among ourselves. So what we have done from ourselves, we had to be coherent, first of all. We had to be disciplined, and we have to be, most importantly, cooperative with all regulations that are in place. So it has not been easy. It was not easy to just close down. You had to close down because you are facing an epidemic. For that matter, you had to migrate and involve into the actual mode of offering and start developing content so that it can suit the students.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morangi, for that. Mr. Piekas?
Honorable Deputy Minister, I believe we understand the peculiar nature of the challenges within the TVET sector, but these are not challenges that are insurmountable. I think it's important as my parting words to emphasize that engagement is going to remain central in whatever endeavors we embark upon. Engagement, ongoing engagement with our line ministry, other stakeholders, officers, ministries, agencies, more so the unions and our training providers. We're also looking closely at the training providers in the TVET space, particularly the ones we are funding, and we have line of sight exactly as to where they are now, what the needs would be over the next 2 to 3 months, and we are engaging them. But I think at the end of the day, what I want to emphasize is that at all times, there are two principles that are non-negotiable. One is for us collectively to look at equitable access, regardless of what we embark upon. And that we can only do if we begin to work together as a collective. And secondly, to always align to government regulations and measures implemented by the presidency or the Ministry of Health and Social Services. Because I think if we begin to make decisions in our individual space that are contrary to the national imperatives and endeavors, we're going to create all sorts of challenges. So what I want to say at the end of the day, yes, COVID has brought a lot of challenges. We're dealing with a lot. But it's time for us now, if I can look at that silver lining, for us as ordinary people to begin to do extraordinary things as a collective, through partnership, getting out of our silos and begin to work together. It's, I think, Heraclitus that once said, if I may go back to that old adage, that a man will not walk through the same river twice. And it was still a bit, I think, insensitive from a gender perspective. A man will not walk through the same river twice, for he's not the same man and it's not the same river. So that should be the learning we take from this. Should a pandemic like COVID come to our shores again in another 2, 3, 4 years' time, we should be ready as a country to face it. And we should be ready then to succeed, regardless of the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Piekus. Mr. Finis, just round it up for us this afternoon.
Just from our side, as the Namibian National Students Organization, we are always ready. We are complying, we are calling on our members, we've been actively calling on our entire network in all 14 political regions for students to comply with government regulations, for students to be agents of education. We are feeding our members with information so that once they are in the community, in their individual households, they can educate around them as well, especially the ones that are older. It's important because they speak the vernacular languages. We are still trying to communicate everything simultaneously in vernacular languages, and it's hard. So NANSO is already working on the ground. NANSO is working in the homes of students to ensure that we tell our members, teach your little brother and your little sister. You are already in university, you are home now. Take the kids in the village, because in villages people anyway live in compounds together. Take them all together, social distance them, be safe, and teach there where you are. Let us as students take up this mantle in the meantime, so that the young ones stay fresh. And they say, there's a quote that says, every time I teach, I learn. So even our students from university that are engaging in these activities are busy. I must commend the NTA. I think a lot of the times in our conversations in higher education, we leave the training authorities and the training institutions behind in this. But I think even now in this crisis, where we see that because we are not an industrialized economy, how important the trainees are to us. And we are more than willing to work with you. NANSO is opening itself up to all stakeholders in education. We are not here to compete. We are just representing students' interest here, and we are willing to use our resources, no matter how limited they are, to take both the hand of government and every relevant stakeholder so that we can ride through this wave and we can come out on top of this one. I believe it will change the way we educate in Namibia. It will change our entire education landscape. But for it to change into a marvelous system, it is important that we work now together as one unit, and like Mr. Jerry said, not as institutions in our little cocoons, to ensure that we make sure that whatever the outcome of this crisis is, we will be able to say that we capitalized on it, and the Namibian child, the Namibian teacher, lecturer, the institutions, and everyone wins at the end of the day. And that's all NANSO wants.
Thank you very much. I'd also just like to add that NANSO has a gender-based violence or abuse toll-free number that students and learners can call, which is 085-73-77357. That is 085 7377 357. Would also like to urge all our viewers and listeners to continue calling the Ministry of Health emergency line, which is 0800 100 100, to ensure that you are able to communicate to our health professionals should you suspect that you have COVID-19 or simply ask for information around the virus. That's all the time we had today. I'd like to thank our panelists as well as our media partners for ensuring that we get the correct messaging as well as information to every citizen in Namibia on television, on social media, on our radio platforms. Would also like to repeat our email address, us from MICT, to ensure that we're able to engage you and that you don't feel left out. That is at covid.num@mict.gov.na, covid.num@mict.gov.na for that discussion. And thank you again for joining us this afternoon.